and the rest of thank you for recording. Disconnect between humans and the rest of the web of life. So I don't think we can look at any of the SDGs in isolation from this core relationship issue that we're facing as a species. And fortunately, we're not the first to ask this question. There have been many people who are trying to figure out how can we live in more harmony and more balance, and also have our institutions be more aware of this, whether it is legal institutions, economic institutions, social, cultural institutions. And so with that question in mind, I was looking around for people who've been churning on that. 1 second, I'm getting another call about fixing the issue, which is a and so then yeah, I learned more about that there's a whole movement talking about the rights of nature, whether it's the rights of river, species, so that we can find a way to represent other living creatures in human decision-making forums like courts. I am not an expert on this topic. I am just deeply frustrated by the lack of being able to actually bring these voices into decisions where we seem to be making not very wise decisions that have a lot of impact on the rest of life. So calling for this session, and so the people who know more about this are Shristi, Danny, and Lakshmi. And is Shristi actually on the call? Because I can see Danny and Lakshmi.
Her video is not on.
Oh, okay, great. Yay, super. Thanks, Shristi. Yeah, what we thought, I mean, I know I wasted the first 15 minutes. What we thought first is to have maybe 15 minutes for each of them to speak, and then we would have some time left. Now that we have less time, maybe we want to do things slightly differently or not. What do you think? Because we have another, how much time do we have left actually?
I think this 40 minutes, I think.
40 minutes? Yes? So we can we do like 10 minutes each, and then we have 10 times 3 is 30, and then we have 10 minutes for Q&A?
Guys, I would actually prefer if Danny and Srishti actually give their talks, because I was responding to them. That can be shorter.
Okay.
They prepare their talks, let them. I mean, this is my suggestion.
Sounds good. So should we just jump into it? So I'll give you the floor, Shristi, and then after 15 minutes is over to Danny.
Yeah, sure. But I realize Danny has to leave at so should we give, in case she has to leave immediately, should we give space to her first and then give?
Okay.
No, I'm fine. Okay, then can the host give me sharing screen, right?
Do I know how to do that, or is that?
So I hope you can see my screen. Yeah, so I will speak about rights of nature, what's happening in India, because that's the context I'm most familiar with. What's happening outside India, which is the context that I'm not very familiar, but I'm part of the networks and learning from them. And then what does it mean for us to move ahead of those, and in terms of what actions and what collaborations we need to do to be able to do that. So before I get into that, I want to also give a bit of a background of general crisis of environmental governance in India and why we need to begin talking about some of these issues. So one is that we are still in colonial hangover. Most of our institutions still pretty much operate in that mindset of looking at rest of nature as resources to be extracted and appropriated. The second is regulatory failure, which is that most of the decision making happens in Delhi or in Mumbai, where rather than actually empowering the local communities and people who are most immediately dependent on these ecosystems. We still continue with the same growth model, where we want to continue with extractivism and also speak about, say, environment protection. The fourth is limits to judicial activism. We know that there have been some progressive judgments in the past, but there's that much that the judiciary can do, despite us having enough independence, but not so much that they can really come out with or change the spaces in the society. And fifth is something that looms over the entire conservation scenario of the country, is when the conservation is supposedly assumed to be environmentalism, which is that if you create protected areas or national parks or sanctuary, that is enough to really protect the environment, and which we see is not really. So it's not that many of these have not been responded to. In the 1970s and 80s, there have been massive movements across India, and in many parts, very regional movements and national level movements that have spoken against these extractive development projects, and in fact resulted into very progressive environmental policies. We didn't have a Ministry of Environment until a very long time, and these movements actually resulted into. Why this is important to bring in this perspective, especially because we are talking about rights of nature, and the role of local movements in that context is very, very crucial. And hence it sets a background for us of why we need to talk about, because a lot of people ask that we already have existing laws and policies, so why now rights of nature, why a new law? And so what we see through these crises is that the current environmental laws and policy have been used as a means to sanction environmental destruction rather than protecting the environment. And the current crisis that we are in is fundamentally asking us to rethink the economic, political, ecological systems that we are in. It is also signaling us a shift from extractive, colonial, and a property-oriented mindset, and rooting ourselves in indigenous and nature-dependent communities, cosmologies, and worldviews. I gave some example, but I don't want to get into too much of a detail because of the lack of time. But many of these are already in many ways articulating their own relationship with rest of nature, which is where the rights of nature movement has to root itself, and in many places has rooted, and in others that are emerging must be acknowledging and really embedded in that. Some of us who have been working on this issue, why we feel it is relevant is based on our own interactions with peoples and communities that we work with. And so some of those I just want to mention so that my own position on why I'm speaking about this is also clearer to the people who are listening here today. Is that, say, this indigenous person in central India, Sumaru Kallo, a Gond Adivasi, articulates their relationship with rest of nature as believing that the spirits and the gods resides in rock, trees, and animals, and in fact, in every element of nature. So when they're protesting against a mining project in their territories, it's not just about loss of their livelihoods, but it is so much more about the loss of the spirits in the forest, loss of species in the forest, and their sense of what a democracy is, what a community is, extends beyond just humans. Similarly, how women articulate their relationship with the forest is very different from looking at it as just a mere resource for livelihoods, but how it is intricately linked and woven with their life. The top is from the Lepchas of the Zongu River in the Northeast India, where the communities believe that the river cannot be dammed. It's because it's the passage to reach the other life when a person dies in this life. So these articulations are important for us to look into how people view this relationship with nature, and where then rights of nature as a discourse come to complement or strengthen the movement. So there are 4 approaches across the world that I want to highlight that have been used in this kind of a movement that is emerging. One is articulating about earth-centered governance, which is again rooted in indigenous cosmologies of how people have looked at territories not from just a human perspective, but how it is also about the lands, it is also about the migration of animals. And so it's a more broader idea of governance and decision making in that way, but is also complemented with more recent approaches or more Western approaches of, say, bioregionalism or eco-governance, stuff like that. The second is a constitutional approach where the constitution recognizes the rights of nature itself, and it is amended in the constitution. I'll give one example of such. The third is indigenous and relational approach, and we see this happening in many examples that I've given, but also actively communities actually coming up with Bill of Rights in their indigenous constitutions or in their indigenous tribal councils, where they are articulating of why and what they mean by rights of nature. And the fourth is a judicial approach, which is the court orders and judgment. There's a worldwide movement starting from Ecuador, where in 2008, the rights were granted in the constitution. In the US, several ordinances were passed. In Colombia, where Ortorato River was granted rights. And it's not just rivers, but also national parks like the Urewara, where in New Zealand, it had got rights. And then very recently in Chile, there's a whole process going on with constitutional amendments to approve rights of nature. So there are several examples, of course, can't get into all of them, but I want to mention a few which give us a bit of a analytical lens to look at the India judgments. So first is the Tihiawa Tupa Act in New Zealand, which was passed by the parliament, recognizing the historical injustice done to the indigenous Ewe people. And it has emerged out of 150 years of people's struggle, very rooted in their own articulation of what it is to be part of a river ecosystem. So we are the river and the river is us. And the Crown recognized and apologized the violations done in the past and gave rights to the river in terms of legal personhood. The other one is Atorato River in Colombia, one of the major tributaries of the Amazon River, where biocultural rights were recognized, linking it closely with rights of rivers and the rights of indigenous communities. Ecuador is already I've mentioned, but what I want to highlight is that their constitutional amendment was rooted in recognizing the good living, quote unquote, the Indian indigenous concept of an alternative vision of well-being. And it was strongly argued by the local civil society of what it really means, not what was articulated by the left government then, but what people and communities have been really articulating. These are some of the declarations that you can, if interested, take a look at. Rights of Mother Earth, Universal Declaration that was passed in 2016, and then Rights of Rivers Declaration that has come out very recently by various groups across the world. And that some of us have also contributed. So what happened in India, that's the crux of this presentation for now. So what happened is that in 2017, the Uttarakhand High Court, one of the North Indian states in India, passed a judgment recognizing the rights of rivers, Ganga and Yamuna, one of the most sacred rivers in India, as having the right to exist, persist, and hence having the status of a legal person. I'll get into what does that mean. And the same High Court in 2018 recognized the rights of the entire animal kingdom. In 2020, Punjab and Haryana High Court, but the same judge, Rajiv Sharma, passed a judgment recognizing rights of a lake in city of Chandigarh, Sukhna. And as recent as last month, the Madras High Court observed that the Mother Earth has rights like that of a legal person. Now, that this 2017 judgment was challenged by the Uttarakhand state government in the Supreme Court of India, saying that this is completely illogical. We cannot implement such a judgment, and hence it had put a stay order on it. While giving this judgment, I will look at specifically the 2017 judgment because it is instructive and a little more detailed than the others. One is that it evoked directive principles that the state has a duty to protect the environment. It also evoked fundamental duties to protect natural environment as citizens of India. And it's not that this is the first time that the apex court, like the courts have had this ecological consciousness or ecocentric approaches to judgment. There have been several in the past. So one is not saying that this is the first time. In fact, a very progressive judgment was passed in 2013, where the Supreme Court recognized the rights of the Domriya Konds, the indigenous community in central India, and their cultural rights to protecting their sacred territories, which they called as Niyam Raja. Now for us, what are the points to consider, which was also interesting for us to see where the decision making begins and what we need to really do for this movement to work on the ground. One is that one is the legal person. A lot of people ask, what does it mean to recognize rivers as legal person? In the language of law is that injury can be recognized, you have the right to sue and can be sued. In that context, then what are the rights and liabilities of a living person, and especially in this context of rivers or other ecosystems? Now, the court considered river as a minor and appointed state guardians. The first question is that the state that has been actually sanctioning destructive projects, how automatically it will be protecting the river's rights? And the second is that it did not speak about the role of local communities. And so hence for us to look at what it would mean. And in the case of violation of rights, what is the violation? The court did not define that. It did not define if they are violated, how the river will be compensated. You and I can be compensated in form of cash, but how would a river be compensated? And what would be the restitution process in that? To whom and in what form? And importantly, what is a river? Now, that's an important question to consider, because as a civil society working on river issues or with dependent communities, that has not comprehensively happened. The other broader concern is governance mechanism. A river is flowing through, say, for example, the picture that you see is of Indus River in Ladakh, but the river flows through India, China, Pakistan. So what does happen to the rights of the rivers for the transboundary rivers, because nature doesn't follow any nation state boundaries or human made boundaries? So what do we do with that? Then the potential of misuse, because we've seen that a lot of progressive environmental judgments have actually been used against local communities by restricting their rights. So what do we do about that? And then there has been no grassroots movement, and that's why I mentioned the TV Avatu Pact, where there was a long struggle of people's movement, whereas this happened at a very top-down level. And so to unpack some of these questions, some of the people who have been involved in these issues for a long time met and began this process of actually answering some of these concerns that had come up post the judgment and in general exist in our own understanding of things. And so the definition of river emerged as a river is a civilization that includes aquatic flora and fauna, the biodiversity in its catchment area, forests, its tributaries, groundwater, which is usually ignored when we're thinking about a river, its rocks, soil in its bed and banks, and very importantly, human communities that are immediately dependent on it. We cannot separate humans from the rivers, and we cannot separate humans from the rest of nature. And that is an important connotation that has to run through most of these processes, for us at least, people who are wanting to take this forward. And so hence rights of rivers in that sense would mean any ecological causes and conditions that make up the natural habitat of the river and maintain its integrity. Some of the very organically what emerged as rights is of course right to flow unhindered, to meander, because that is a nature of a river. And if it wants to flood it floodplain, it has to. Humans have to stop building their houses in the floodplains or doing construction in the floodplains. And it has a right to maintain its soil and water flow, groundwater flow, and various other, these are also part of the, say, Universal Declaration on Rights of Rivers. But I think what is essential is something that school children of a Chumathang, of a remote village in Ladakh said when we asked about what would be the rights of river Indus according to them. And they said that the river has a right to sing, the river has a right to play. Now those kind of connotations can only be by people who are living along the river, because they know what it is for a river to sing. When I asked them, they said that a river flows through the rocks, it makes that sound, and that's why I think the river has the right to sing. So those kind of connotations. And the next one that you see, the river has a right to behna, khelna, khilana, to flow, to play, to feed, is again by an indigenous activists from the Northeast India, and this is how they articulated rights. And hence it is important for us to look at rights from those perspectives rather than a Western legal, very straitjacketed jacketed perspective. And hence the duties of the rivers will be defined by their intrinsic nature, not what we think as humans our duties are. And hence the natural duties corresponding to the natural rights. Implementation, what we observe from various parts of the world, that it has to be that we approach the lower courts. There's an active civil society pressure that looks at the lower courts, that looks at the more regional level execution rather than at a national level. It is important that we link nature rights with indigenous community rights. Very essential that the local democratic institutions, in case of India, the village assemblies, the Gram Sabhas, area Sabhas in cities, need to be strengthened to be able for this to happen, for people to be able to take control over what happens in their territories. And then we need a consultative process, which doesn't mean that only state actors are involved, but scientists, people, civil society, many people who are in some ways connected or have the sense of expertise around these issues are part of all these decision-making process. That is essential that we define the violation. So any obstruction or impediment that disenables the entity from performing its ecological functions come under violation. The court very conveniently did not define the violations. It said pollution is happening to the river Ganga and hence it must have rights. But it's not just pollution, and we know some very destructive projects continue to happen in the guise of development of the river or whatnot. And one such is in the picture that you see. But what is most essential for any of this framework to really work, to bring about the transformations that we're seeking to bring about, is that we have to question the crises, roots of these crises. One is the development growth model. If we continue with the same extractive development growth model and also in the same breath talk about rights of nature, it's not going to change anything fundamentally. So we have to question that as a movement. The second is, of course, the centralized political governance model. So if again we continue with those and not empowering local communities to be able to self-determine what happens in their territories, it's a problem. We have to also question the legal framework that is still anthropocentric. We are finding ways to make sure that voices of nature can come out. We're using these different tools of biocultural rights or legal personhood, but it is still in the framework of anthropocentrism. So how do we move beyond that and bring in pluriversal legal frameworks? The fourth is recognizing the limits of a process as well. So rights of nature is a means toward a larger transformation that we want to achieve, but not really an end to itself. And that's what is very crucial for us when we are looking at this framework. And hence, I want to just briefly reflect on this framework that has emerged from a process that I'm part of, Alternative Confluences, Vikalp Sangam in India. So while we're looking at the ecological resilience and wisdom, it is important that we also look at how we begin imagining our own territories from an ecological point of view. So bioregionalism and all those kinds of discourses of governance then comes from a radical democracy perspective and the community's empowerment through that. And that's how it is connected to economic democracy itself. So if you would continue with the destructive economic discourse, rights of nature cannot be guaranteed. So how do we move towards an economy of care and share and self-reliant, which is not dependent on getting our basic needs served from miles away from where we are? Again, it is very crucially related to social justice and well-being. So within communities and also around us, we see a lot of access and issue of being able to take control over our local means of production is limited by ways of where we are, what ethnicity we come from, what caste we come from, what religion we belong to. So those questions again become very central to our discourse. And again, the knowledge and pluriversal ways of dealing with many of these issues is very important and central to the whole movement. So again, there is multiple ways of celebrating life and relating to nature and how it is accommodative of that. Yeah, so let's go to what's ahead. I think I might have gone beyond time. It is that we need more awareness, campaigning, and advocacy on this issue. What is, I think, most central is that we have to decolonize the whole framework of rights and speak in a language that is most relatable to people and communities that we work with. At a South Asian level, we have to devise legal and policy strategies. Why I stress at South Asian level is that looking it through from a nation state perspective will limit our own understanding and our own processes around this. Using international laws wherever they're useful. The fourth important element of this is that the customary or traditional laws that communities have been using for a long time need to be studied more, but importantly, their relationship with the formal law needs to be bridged. So how can we do that effectively? And so that needs to be worked on more. More groundwork, more conversations such as these are important to be able to educate ourselves around these issues, but also how do we move forward it, because it is so much emergent in many ways. And wherever we are, so local processes as I was hinting earlier, wherever people have focused on their own local processes and territories, it has been much more effective. And training and exposures of lawyers and judges to be able to imagine radically is again an important element of it. So these are some of the movements, networks that are trying to do this at a global level, at a regional level. And if you're interested, you can get in touch with them and let me know. I can also put you in touch with some of those. And I think I'll stop at this moment. I have really gone fast, so I'm sorry if I've spoken too fast, and I'm sorry if anything was unclear, but I'm happy to answer your questions when we open up. Thank you, guys. Over to you.
Wow. And will you also be able to share that presentation later? Because that was a roller coaster, like a master class in 15 minutes. Yeah, amazing. I'm very keen to hear also from Danny. Yeah, I'm not sure whether we have time like to do a whole like unique presentation, but maybe if you can riff off what got triggered when you were listening to Shristi, and you know, where you feel there are differences or complementarities between your approach and what she's been presenting, that would be awesome.
Sure. So I just messaged Heis while Shristi was speaking to say that that was such an incredibly rich presentation, and I think it's really important for people to have an opportunity to talk about what Shristi presented. So I don't really want to speak for 15 minutes. That will take us through to the end. I'm happy to speak to you guys on another occasion. What I was going to speak about, and I think I'll just raise it as a complementary approach to Shristi's. So Shristi was very much speaking about the way in which people who haven't been dominated by Western models of the hierarchy of life understand the world and the importance of following their sense making and not just continuing to dominate them from a social point of view, but also, of course, from an ecological point of view. And what I was going to talk about was how within Western justice theory itself, I have come to really reject an anthropocentric conception of justice and anthropocentric institutions of justice, because I think that even within Western frames, they no longer make sense. And there are three reasons that I think they no longer make sense. The first one is that the whole idea of human rights, which so many of us have ascribed to, the basic premise was there shouldn't be arbitrary distinctions. So arbitrary distinctions on the basis of gender, ability, sexuality, race, religion. But the ultimate arbitrary distinction is the distinction between humans and beings other than humans. And so many of the foundations that distinction has rested on, theological foundations, metaphysical foundations, pseudoscientific foundations, they're all starting to fall away. So from that perspective, it becomes an arbitrary distinction. The second is that from pretty much every Western knowledge system, whether it's biology, physics, sociology, philosophy, we're really coming to understand that the idea of the human and the idea of the individual, the autonomous individual, both of which are at the heart of Western justice systems, just they don't make sense, right? Whether it's the microbiome in my gut, which is actually responsible for how I feel and my capacity to think, or the production of oxygen and the absorption of carbon dioxide by forests and trees that makes it possible for humans to live. So this idea that humans could flourish, that humans could live decent lives, absent care for the conditions of flourishing for the more than human world, that also doesn't make sense. So that's really what I wanted to say, that it's not just, yes, of course, you know, that Indigenous knowledges that have been so violently repressed in Western modernism and are a source of incredible wisdom around different understandings of who counts and what it is to be an ethical subject in the world. But even from within the knowledge systems and the sense making of the West, this no longer makes sense as a viable way of thinking about or institutionalizing justice. And I think the final thing I'll say, really just to, I guess, to make this real in my own context is, so I live on the southeast coast of Australia, and I live in an intentional multi-species community. And actually in the winter of 2019, we talk about the Black Summer fires, but they actually started in August, which is winter, when the Black Summer fires started to burn, and they came closer and closer to where we live. And we had the experience that I live in the rainforest, and rainforests aren't supposed to burn, but some of the most important rainforests on the east coast of Australia burned around Dorrigo. And 3.25 billion vertebrates were killed. Now that is an unimaginable number, just to give you a sense of what that number means, because we can't even begin to grasp that. If you spent 10 seconds resting your mind on every one of those 3.25 billion animals, it would take you 950 years. That's 11 really good human lifetimes doing nothing but thinking about the death of those 3.25 billion animals. 18.5 million hectares was burnt. So, you know, the size of Belgium was burnt. I think bigger than that. So the real impacts of anthropogenic climate change, of deforestation, of the destruction on the environment are now at a point that there is no possibility of living a decent human life, even if we think of humans as being separate, without understanding this. You know, we couldn't breathe for 3 months. The sky was the color of a bruise for 3 months. You know, entire landscapes are going to be, rainforests will never grow back. So I've gone from the somewhat abstract to the very concrete. But I think when we actually come face to face with the gargantuan scale of destruction driven by a system of justice for humans and development for humans that is generating this type of complete deconstruction of the conditions of possibility of our own lives, then again, from a confrontation point of view, confronting what it is to live in the world, it forces this very radical rethinking of what justice, what legal institutions, what political institutions ought to look like. So that's enough for me.
Thank you. Lakshmi, you want to say a few words? You have to unmute yourself.
Sorry.
Thank you, guys. I'll make it quick. I see a hand raised. Is that a question for Danny?
It's fine. You go ahead. Would lovely to hear from you. Great, go.
Thanks. I won't take long. I was asked to respond to both Shrishti and Danny's talks, and I don't know how to respond to the breadth of concepts that has been brought into this talk right now. But what I will talk about very quickly about what I am concerned with within these very broad frameworks. And, you know, Shrishti talked about the broad arena within which we are playing right now, the broad constructs that are abstract. And it sort of lays the foundation thinking about the world at large. And Danny, thank you for bringing that straight to the heart of our experience of the world right now. And I guess I place myself somewhere in between, because I'm interested in the individual and culture and how that relates to our justice systems or how we live in this world. So as a multi-species being, just as an individual, what does it mean to be human in this world right now, knowing that everything that I know about myself and the world does not relate to my experience of myself? And by that, I mean that I act from predetermined conditions of colonization, of caste systems, of privilege, of an education system that is part of the system. And as an individual, I definitely, even though I have worked on some of those issues, I behave on a daily basis from that standpoint. Even though I know that I am a multi-species being, what does that actually mean to live in this world? So that's my question. And then what does that mean for human culture now that we have all of this information at hand? And how do we create spaces where we can talk about this? And how can we shift as individuals and as a culture towards a more lived experience of a multi-species being and a multi-species culture? Because I find that, you know, we're being asked to live in this world from two different directions. We have to, at the same time, work on changing the system from a very multi-scale earth level, and at the same time work on ourselves and culture. So it has to meet somewhere. At some point, maybe in the next 20 years, if we are to make any impact, any real impact with what we are talking about. And so what is that space that we meet? Where would this meet our individual experiences, our cultural experiences, and what we know that should happen on this earth at a global scale? So I will stop there. These are all questions that do not have answers, but I'm just throwing them because I think they're important. Thank you.
Thank you. G2G, I'm not sure that is your name, but that's what it says.
It would be a great name. I'll maybe change my name. My name's Justin Kenrick. These are three really wonderful, really extraordinary,
Please go ahead.
Three painful presentations, but really good. I work for a human rights organization that supports forest peoples to stop them being thrown off their lands. And my colleagues find it very difficult that I don't find the rights basis very useful. The notion of rights seems such a difficult place to start from, as was being said. And there's something about the folk I work with tend to think of, they want the right to be responsible. They want the right to carry out their responsibilities. They want the right to continue their relations rather than being kind of in opposition to that. But my basic question was back to Shrishti, which is just that the rights of nature language can be so used by conservationists and so on to evict, to bolster the eviction of indigenous peoples from their lands, that I find it so dangerous without it having it's more the rights of us, because if we're talking about humans here, we're talking amongst humans, how should we behave towards the rest of beings? So it's like, how can we have the right where we live to be responsible for all others here, to be in relationships of care and responsibility? So I just wanted to ask the question about how do you guard against the way this language can be used to impose control rather than to enable resilient relations amongst people embedded in place? Thank you.
I'm a little hesitant only because I've taken so much space and time. So I'm just hesitant unless there's other questions. for comments or reflections. Okay. So Justin, I think I see myself as the way I had also kind of position myself into various spaces that I'm interacting with around rights discourse is where I'm using my space and time as somebody who's guarding against these concerns, because I think increasingly that is the danger of first of all co-option of this by many people, by many popular and also powerful institutes of language of rights of nature, harmony with nature and such. And so I see myself as somebody who wants to raise these cautions, and that is why I think in my whole presentation that was the underlying tone of also why we need to keep speaking about systemic transformations while we are also speaking about rights of nature. And I think in my understanding about rights, say a lot of how indigenous communities have spoken about rights, they actually took a departure when the whole human rights framework emerged. They took a departure from looking at rights from an individual rights perspective to looking at how they do it in a collective rights perspective. And that is why the declaration that was eventually passed by indigenous peoples, that is an important aspect for us to look into. Also for the rights of nature discourse. So we don't have to look at individual species, which happens a lot in many Western discourses when they're speaking about rights of nature, or individual ecosystems, but how we look at ecosystems rather than looking at a binary of separating humans from the nature. And that is why, again, how do we speak this language? When I speak rights and nature, or when we speak humans and nature, then we anyway creating this binary. So how do we speak in a language when we say humans and the rest of nature? So then the binary immediately breaks. There is no binary. We are very much part of nature. And again, that's where community articulations have to be very importantly rooted in this discourse. So for example, the TV Tupa Act that was passed in New Zealand, it was in a long-term negotiation with the Crown, because they couldn't find the right tool to articulate this. And then eventually the negotiations reached a point where legal personhood was closer to what people really articulated in terms of their relationship with nature, which is that they looked at Wanganui River ecosystem as a living person, as a entity that has an agency, that is actually in many ways giving instructions to people of how to live in that ecosystem. And so legal personhood in that way came very close to their articulations, not enough, not adequate, and still needs to be worked upon, but that's where it came. But in say context of India, legal personhood might not be the right tool for two reasons. One is that the river Ganga is not a person, she's a goddess. So she cannot be accorded rights like a goddess. So every context would have very different interpretations and very different articulations. And that is why I was stressing that there's a need to really do this work with peoples and communities, seeing some potential of it being able to change and being able to stop certain destructive projects, as we see in many cases in Ecuador, where local courts have been able to stop many destructive projects because they were using and evoking rights of nature, which is again very rooted in their own cosmovisions of how they relate with the Pachamama. And so if we are able to root ourselves into that, and the articulations are not based on individual rights framework that we see in most of the law discourse, but rather collective right discourse, which we see in a lot of customary laws and practices, then we might make a headway. But it's a long process, and that's why some people have to keep bringing these questions and concerns into the discourse, else it would very much take to the point where we have seen how a lot of progressive, so-called progressive judgments or discourses have done to peoples and communities' territories. Now I'll stop.
Okay, I am conscious of the fact that we just hit our time, and I also see Natalia raised her hand. I just wanted to say that this is not the end of the conversation. This is the beginning of the conversation, or a continuation of the conversation. And I want to propose to find a virtual space where we can meet and we can share notes and thoughts and ideas. Oh, really? No, Tobias, is it another half an hour? Oh, that is interesting. I thought we just had 1 hour. Does everybody think it's going for another half an hour?
Party time.
Yeah, I don't know if everybody has that time. That is news to me.
Guys,
How
the
about, I know Danny needs to leave. You have
calendar invite was for 1.5 hours.
the calendar invite says 1.5 hours.
Hmm.
Wow. Okay, my mistake. So
I could
yeah.
stay another 15 minutes. It's just I've got at in whatever 55 minutes my time, which is 7 o'clock. I've got another 2-hour talk in Sweden, so I just need to stop and like feed my animals.
All right. 15 minutes sounds like a great compromise. I wanted to, and we'll get to your question, Natalia. Wanted to make sure that even after 15 minutes, we have some place where we can find each other once we log off and go back into cyberspace. So my proposal is to meet at Lakshmi's virtual house, which is a website called Inner Climate Academy. Maybe Lakshmi, can you post the website? You pay? Okay, great, amazing. Because then we can make some shared documents and we can continue this, and then we can see like what kind of actions come out of that. Does that sound relevant for people? And we can circle back when we do the SDG catalyst group and groups. Okay, so having said that, Natalia, go for it.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, very interesting to listen. Do you hear me well? Because I'm in a cafe and I just I just wanted to share my point of view, which can be interesting because it's from another point of view on the question. Because I'm a performer and I'm working on listening rituals. And just in the moment, I just walked with a group of other artists from the sources of the Loire, the river in France, till the moment where we can navigate her. And we did a kind of almost silent walk for 1 week. And our aim, our intention was to listen to the river. And so you were saying it's time maybe to unmute. I would say maybe it's time to mute as humans if we wanna, because it's also anthropocentric thing that we give rights to the natural elements, but they have already their own rights. And maybe if we shut up and if we stop trying to do things, maybe they will just show us what they need and what they need from us. And so now I continued my trip along another river, like the Dordogne. I just had to go in this cafe because I had no more battery. But yeah, I'm getting in a dialogue with this water flow, and also just walking next to the river, following the river, and meditating when I see, for example, I met 4 big dams on the river. So I feel how the river becomes mute, how it becomes motionless, and I feel sadness. I feel so emotions go through my body, and I understand what is happening from a sensorial, a sensitive, and so that guides me to action, and that guides me to yeah. So it's, I think I'm half Colombian, half French, so I have some affinities with also like Colombian and traditional medicine cultures and etc. But I think this point of view, that we approach things not with our words but with our sensitivity, and that talks it's a lot about being silent, about going into that nature that we want, that we are talking so much about, just going and just being there and feeling. For me, it would be one of, maybe the first of, or one of the things to do. Yeah, thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Yeah, it feels like many tributaries in a similar series of streams. I also see Eva raise their hands.
Very fun. Didn't realize I had a frog in my throat. Thank you so much to the speakers. Those were really, really interesting and informative talks. And yeah, I wanted to add something, and I think it's still in this same flow. But I think that Shrishti really put her finger on something when she said that the Ganga is a goddess. And I think that one of the approaches, and there needs, of course, to be many, because there isn't one right one. We don't know how to solve these multiple crises that we're in. So, you know, the legal approach is just great. It's just fantastic, and I'm so glad that people are doing it. And I think that a spiritual approach is also really important. And something for me about re-sacralization, very much what the last speaker was speaking to, this kind of like re-emerging, re-engaging with nature in a spiritual way. Because the kind of Western domination mindset has narrowed and narrowed and narrowed our what is allowed to be experienced as sacred, and you know it all happens in a big old building, and there's one guy up there, or maybe two or three, who we kind of have intermediaries to, and yet we know from indigenous people that the whole world is sacred, that everything in it is sacred. And the sacredness is the thing that means that we can't do harm. It's almost like an alternative approach to rights. An agreement that some things just are sacred, and so we won't do them harm. We will only celebrate them. Yeah, that's what I was. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I just realized while you were saying that, you know, I was inviting people to come and spoke about the voice of nature and decision making, and I was looking at this and like, oops, decision making is all about cutting through stuff. So yeah, it raises a lot more about where the question comes from. So thank you very much.
Hais, maybe you want to talk a little bit about what what that other home would be and what's the intention, so people know.
Yeah, totally. So that it came very alive when Natalia, you were talking about this practice of going in silence and following the river, and Shrishti was talking about all kinds of and merging different practices from different schools and different movements. And I'm working on another project. I don't know if anybody is here on the call, which is coming from that, which is using technology to translate voices of the modern human world into decision-making arenas and forums. So because there's all these convergences of different schools and movements, bringing with them different types of ritual, different types of ceremony, different frames of thought. Basically, what I'm excited about is finding some place where we can bring those things, whether it's a method, whether it's a practice, whether it's a frame of sense making, and then see actually what I'm sure it's really diverse, and then see what emerges from that, and then what feels, what we feel called to act on more. Maybe like combine two different practices, maybe walking along the river and then like mentally reflecting on what does it mean in terms of like a personhood for the river, or that's, and there could be many different unpredictable convergences and synergies, of these different approaches. So that's my intention of like bringing in the diversity, making it visible, and then seeing what that does and what we feel called to do next. Is that clear enough?
So if you're interested, maybe you can put down your emails and we will send you an email with the website also if you'd like, or do you even just leave the website here and have people come? Okay, people are putting down their emails. That's great. So let's collect emails and we will send you a common email with the document on the website and other details. Thank you.
Also for that practical. We have another like 1 or 2 minutes. This Zoom, Julia, so she will get all those things like the video, the chat, the audio, the all of that. And Julia is there, she's available. And thank you, Shristi, very much for this massive masterclass. Much time to understand it. Thank you, Lakshmi. Thank you, everybody, for asking questions and bringing in your experience, perspective, and questions. Yeah, I'm a little overwhelmed, so I'm going to take some time to digest what just happened, and I am looking forward to see you, some of you, in the real world, and some of you soon. And thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Great to see you.
Guys, I want to take a photo of your face right now. You're frozen in such a great heist moment.
Oh, it's always weird to stop things like that, no? Like, and everyone disconnects, and you're like, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I got a picture.
And you are both in India?
Yes. Yeah. Natalie, I
Wow.
had messaged you. I had asked you whether I could look up your work somewhere. Is there a website?
Yeah, I have a website that I can send it to you. Um, it's this one.
I facilitate ritualistic spaces with nature.
Mhm.
Not the same, but similar.
Mhm.
I'm really interested in what you do.
Yeah, and I can send you like something that is related to this walk we did, for example. It's this I'm sending to you. It's the Parliament of Loire, of the river, and it's yeah, it's also something that is working on the rights of this river, but really mixing it with artistic approach, and yeah, it's a research going on that thematic.
Oh, beautiful.
And me, I'm really interested on the sensitive part, about the sensitive part, and about the how to listen, like.
Yes. Because we won't get anywhere if our own experience of what is happening around us does not change, all of these remain concepts. And this is where that's where I work in also, but I work with people, bringing them to nature, but not exactly how you do. So I'm seeing parallels. Right.
Yeah, because I really think that, I don't know, yeah, I had kind of deep, long time reflections about how to change, and I was reflecting first on myself, because if I would find how to change my deep structure, then that could be the way of changing other deep structures of other people. Like, I really always think more first about myself and what I can do in myself. And yeah, I really find out that I need to listen, and that we don't know how to listen, that we don't know anymore how to listen, because we are overwhelmed by information. We don't know how to look. So for me, yeah, it was first like stopping everything, stopping talking, stopping doing, just being and seeing what happens. And then when you feel it through your body, then you do what you need to do. That was a bit the.
Yeah, beautiful. And where are you based? In
What?
Ecuador? Are you
No,
based
no. I'm a bit nomad
Okay.
between Belgium, France, and Colombia.
All right. Okay.
Like, my mother is Colombian, and now really the more and more I go there, I really try to get in contact with the Kogis also, which are the indigenous from the Sierra Nevada, which call themselves the guardians of the nature. And I feel this call, like, more and more. And yeah, in France, we are building little shelters. We are building a constellation of shelters for nomad people. And yeah, I'm on the road or on the river.
Great. I want to ask you, I'm doing a few interviews around the question of what does it mean to be alive on Earth right now, when there's a lot of death around us, especially
yeah.
of the more than human. There are a few questions, and I'm doing interviews of just people that I'm meeting who are doing interesting work. And it's a collection that will go into a publication later on. If you'd be interested, I would love to do it with you, do an interview. If I'll send you details, if you can share your email. I've just shared my email, but if you can share yours, I will.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because I also, in this week of being with the river and with the water, there was this theme also, a lot of accepting the end, accepting that we are not anymore living for but we are how to embrace that, this kind of tanatodula, like, how do we learn to die, actually? Because we know how to live, maybe, but do we know how to die? And actually, maybe that's.
Yeah. So I'm very glad I got to meet you. I have to go now.
Me too.
Thank you. I'll be in touch.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ciao.
Thanks. Bye.